I thought it'd be fun to check out two different cameras from the same year and see how similar they are and just how different they really are. Hey there, welcome back to my camera collection. If you're new around here, we like to check out old school retro camcorders, so if you're into that kind of thing, maybe consider subscribing. In today's video, we're going to be checking out the Canon XH-A1 and the Sony HDR FX7. They're both from the same year, they're both professional camcorders, and I just thought it'd be fun to just compare them and see how different they are and see how similar they are. We'll go over the features, we'll go over some of the specs, and at the end of the video we'll check out some test footage that comes out of these, some side by side and some that isn't side by side. You'll hopefully get the point. Let's get into today's video. Now, I wouldn't say that these are necessarily retro camcorders, but they're both from 2006 and they are professional HDV camcorders. They're 17 years old, so I guess you could say that it's in the realm of being retro, but the video quality that comes out of these is actually very, very good. If you know anything about these cameras, the Canon XH-A1 is a very professional camera, and the Sony FX7 is probably not as professional, but I think it's in the ballpark. So we'll start off at the lens here. The Canon XH-A1, the lens thread diameter on it for filters and fisheyes, lens adapters and stuff is 72 millimeters, and the Sony FX7 is 62 millimeters. 10 millimeter difference. They both have two-step ND filters. They're labeled a little bit different, but they are similar. They do the same thing, and we'll get to that when we get to the specs. I'll kind of explain that. But they are built-in ND filters, and the camera will let you know on both of them if you need to use an ND filter or not. The Canon XH-A1, it has 3 manual adjustment rings. I've never seen a camcorder that has 3 manual adjustment rings. So you have the one here on the back, and that is your manual iris or your manual exposure. So you can manually adjust the exposure with this wheel here on the back. The middle one here is your manual zoom, and the bigger one here up on the front is your manual focus. And the Sony FX7 only has 2. So the front one is your focus and this back one is your manual zoom. One thing that they do share in common is they have a 20 times optical zoom, and neither one of them have a digital zoom to them. So 20x zoom is as far as you will go with it. Now, looking on the Canon XH-A1, you'll see a lot of different buttons and switches and dials. So it has a lot of different manual functions and stuff on the body. Under the screen it does. There's just buttons everywhere on this thing. So it also has a very in-depth menu in it. So you can go in there, and if there's anything that's not on the body that you can adjust, you can go in the menu and most likely find it. But this camera is crazy customizable and has a lot of manual features to it. Now, the Sony FX7, it doesn't have as many buttons here on the outside, but when you open up the screen, there is a lot more functions here on the inside of the screen with your playback functions, and your playback functions actually act as other manual functions for the camera. But there are a lot of things that you have to access in the menu. Now, the Canon XH-A1, it only has 2 custom keys to it. Now, if you don't know what a custom key is, they are buttons that are open. And by open, I mean you can assign things in the menu to it. So say if there is no button on the outside of the camera that can turn the stabilization on or off. Well, you can go into the menu and you can actually set it up so that the custom key is set for turning the stabilization on and off if you need to use that, for example. They're just custom keys that you can assign things that are in the menu that you actually end up switching and turning on and off very frequently. The Canon XH-A1 only has 2 of them, but the Sony FX7 actually has 6. Now, you got 3 on the outside of the camera, and then there's 3 on the inside of the screen as well. So lots of manual functions for that and customization, which I think you kind of need because there's not a lot going on the outside of the camera. So it's great that they added 6 of them instead of only 2. Now, one thing that the Canon XH-A1 has that the FX7 doesn't is manual audio level dials. So you can switch it from manual to auto. So if you switch it to manual, you can manually adjust both sides of the audio. So you can dial in your left audio and your right audio to exactly what you need for your video shooting. Now, something that it's probably personal preference, but the Canon XH-A1, the battery actually sits inside the camera itself. So you pop open this door and you slide the battery all the way in, and then you close it. Sliding the battery all the way into the camera like that, it does add a little bit better center of gravity to it. With the Sony FX7, the battery sits on the back like a very traditional camcorder would. It does kind of sit in a little bit, but it does sit on the back of the camera. Will probably be a little bit more back heavy than the Canon XH-A1 would be. It is easier to get to and take the battery off and on instead of sliding it into the camera. Kind of just depends on what you want. You want one that has a little bit better of center of gravity, or would you rather have a battery that you can easily get to and throw a battery on and take one off really quick if you're shooting? And the Canon XH-A1, it has a 2.7-inch LCD screen on it. I gotta say that this screen is just terrible. I kind of talked about this in the review that I did on this camera. You go outside and you can't see any images on it. It's just, once you're in sunlight, the image on the screen is practically just black. It's dark. The color and everything in it is not accurate to what actually is being recorded. It's kind of just hard to see stuff, and to be honest, it's a very small screen for how big this camera is. I mean, it's a 2.7 inch when it should honestly just be a lot bigger. I assume people who did use these back in the day probably rigged up some kind of a monitor to it and had the monitor like up here. The screen on the Sony FX7 is a 3.5 inch LCD screen, and I feel the opposite about this screen. You go outside and you can see the screen very well in sunlight. It shows the video quality or the picture quality very well. It's got good color to it. It's a big enough screen to where you can really see what's going on and not need some kind of a monitor here on top. I really like the screen that's on the FX7. Now the Canon XH-A1, it has this little screen right here that says HDV on it, and that's kind of a nice little feature because it's like a little monitor screen, so you can actually see your battery information, your tape information, and your audio levels on that little screen there. Without having to look at the LCD screen, you can actually look at that, say like if you're filming outside and you're just using the viewfinder, you can use that little screen to monitor your audio, but at the same time you can actually set it up to where you can see all of that information on the LCD screen and the viewfinder itself. The Sony, on the other hand, it doesn't really have any dials or anything here on the outside of it. Everything that you would see that the camera is doing and performing and stuff is on the screen or the LCD screen. Now, another thing that's cool about the Canon XH-A1, I actually haven't seen on any other camera, is the viewfinder. You can actually choose if you want to have a black and white viewfinder or a colored viewfinder. I haven't seen any other camcorder that allows you to do that. And for the Sony FX7, only get a colored viewfinder. You don't get to choose between black and white or colored, but that's pretty much how every other camcorder is out there. So kind of a unique feature to the XH-A1. And staying on the topic of the viewfinder and LCD screen, the Canon XH-A1 also gives you the option to have the LCD screen on along with having the viewfinder on at the same time. So if you are shooting outside and you're shooting looking through the screen, maybe the sun comes out behind a cloud or something and then all of a sudden you can't see the screen, well then you can just pan over and look through the viewfinder and you can use that as well. I find that really cool because most cameras you have to close the screen for the viewfinder to pop on and then open the screen for the viewfinder to turn off and the screen to turn on. And that's exactly how the Sony FX7 is it's that very traditional way of have the LCD screen open to be able to use it and then close it to be able to look through the viewfinder. Now, this is another personal preference one. Kind of just depends on if you're a Canon fan or a Sony fan. I like both, but for Canon, they have their playback buttons or functions right up here on the handle. So you have this little door that closes it, and this feature goes all the way back to the Canon GL1. I've even had a Canon XL1 and it has the exact same features. So I like that they have all the playback functions up here. It kind of gives you more room down on the body for more functions and manual capabilities. And for Sony, generally all of their playback functions, you open the screen and then they're on the inside of the screen here. And the playback buttons or functions while you're in record mode act as different manual functions as well. That's how Sony does it. Again, that's just kind of personal preference, you know, whatever you actually like better. It's not like a big make or break deal, but kind of aesthetically, you might like one or the other. Now, another thing that Canon has always had on their video cameras and even like their DSLRs and mirrorless cameras is they always have a lot of features for the like where the power switch is, or they have some form of a little dial that you can change the video modes. As it is here, you have the power switch is this whole wheel spins. So if you spin it back, it'll go into playback mode, and then switching it forward, you can choose between a bunch of different video modes that are like shutter speed priority or like exposure priority. There's all these different ones. You have a couple different like automatic modes. I'm shooting on a Canon SL3 right now, and it has the same kind of capabilities as that. And for the Sony FX7, where their power switch is here on the back. Very traditional for Sony, right where your record button is, and a lot of other camcorders are that way as well. You have the power switch. So like in the middle is off, and then if you switch it to the left, it's camera mode or record mode, and then switching it to the right is your VCR mode or your playback mode. Now, one of the things that sets these two cameras very far apart, I think, is the audio capabilities. The Canon XH-A1 has 3 different options for audio. You can use the onboard mic, which is here on the front. You can also hook up a external mic, plugs into the side, and then like you can mount your mic up here. It does have to be a powered mic. Third option is XLR audio. So that's what this little bracket is here. You can put a shotgun mic in here, and then you can hook up 2 different XLR mics here. So if you're doing some form of documentary or an interview, you could use this for like podcasting, or if you just want to have XLR audio just for whatever you're shooting on a day-to-day basis, you can hook it all up like that as well. Lots of different options, and then you can obviously change the audio levels and stuff from the little dials here on the back, and that works great for XLR audio because then you can dial in each XLR channel to the exact audio levels that you need them to be or want them. And as for the Sony FX7, you get 2 different audio capabilities. You have the onboard mic and you have external mic plugin. I know there's ways that you can adapt XLR audio to like external mic plugins. So like a cable that hooks into like an XLR mic, and then the other side of the cable is like a headphone jack, and then plugs into the external mic plugin here. I think you can do that as well. I think it might have to have some form of phantom power though, so I'm not exactly sure. The Sony FX7 was released in September of 2006 for $3,500, and the Canon XH-A1 was released in October of 2006 for $4,000. So pretty much just a $500 difference, and you get a much more capable camera that is very professional than the Sony FX7. I don't think you could go wrong with either one of them. But that's just some of the features. We'll talk about the specs on these guys and kind of show you and explain what's similar and what's different, what they're lacking on, and what they are very close to being similar on. So both of these cameras are HDV cameras. These cameras record in 1080i in the HDV mode, and they record in 480p in the DV mode. So you can switch between HDV and DV. HDV is just going to give you a lot better video quality than DV mode. But if you don't know the difference between the P at the end and the I at the end, P stands for progressive and I stands for interlaced. The Canon XH-A1 has a 1/3 of an inch 3CCD sensor in it, and the Sony FX7 has a 1/4 inch 3 CMOS sensor in it. So I think Sony was the only company to use 3 CMOS sensors in them. The ND filters, you have a 2-step ND filter system. First one is a 1 in 6 or a 1/6, and then the second step is a 1 in 32nd or a 32nd. Those are your 2 different options you get. For the Sony FX7, which is just a 1 and a 2, which I would assume that they're the exact same as the Canon XH-A1. So the 1 is probably a 1 a 1/6, and then the 2 is probably a 1/32. So the LCD screen on the Canon XH-A1, it creates 207,000 pixels, and the Sony FX7, its screen creates 211,000 pixels. So, I mean, obviously it's a bigger screen and a better screen, so it's great that it has better pixels or more pixels than the Canon XH-A1 does. But what's kind of weird is the viewfinder on the Canon XH-A1 has more pixels on it than the viewfinder on the Sony FX7. The viewfinder pixels on the XH-A1 is 269,000, where the Sony FX7 has 252,000 pixels. So both cameras actually have memory card slots, and for anybody wondering out there, you cannot record video to these SD cards. You can only take pictures to these SD cards. So don't go buying one of these cameras thinking that you can record video to it, because you're only going to be able to take pictures to it. So you can only record video to the mini DV tape, and you can only take pictures to the SD cards. The Canon XH-A1, it leads a little bit better than the Sony FX7. So you can use SDHC cards, you can use SD cards, and you can use multimedia cards with these. So you can use a high capacity SD card with it, or you can use a multimedia card, which don't really hold very much space to it. This thing's very compatible with really any kind of SD card. Now, as for the Sony FX7, you can only use Sony Memory Stick Pro cards. They're kind of like Sony's version of SD cards, but they only work with Sony products and Sony camcorders, really. Shutter speed range. The Sony FX7, if you're recording with auto shutter speed, it will have a range between 1 in 60 and 1 in 2000. But if you use manual shutter speed, you can dial it in to 1 in 4 or 1 in 10,000. And as for the Canon XH-A1, if you're recording in 60i, 30 frames per second, or pretty much the HDV mode, you can use the shutter speed all the way from 1 in 4 all the way up to 15,000. And if you're recording in the DV mode, it records in 24 frames per second, and you can actually use the shutter speed all the way down to 1/3 all the way up to 15,000. So it's very similar, but just a little bit different on the lowest end minimum shutter speed. You definitely get a much higher shutter speed for this than the Sony FX7, but really 1 in 10,000 shutter speed is still pretty freaking high. The gain range, it kind of messes with the exposure as well. You can go pretty low on the Canon XH-A1 along with going pretty high. So you can go all the way down to -3, and it goes all the way up to 36 dB. As for the Sony FX7, the gain on it, you can only go down to 0, and the highest you can go is 18 dB. Maximum recording time on one tape for the Sony FX7 is 60 minutes, where on the Canon XH-A1, you actually get 80 minutes. And we'll just talk about the dimensions and the weight of these guys. The Sony FX7, it is 5.8 inches wide by 6.2 inches tall, and it is 12.8 inches long, so just a little bit over a foot long. So it's a pretty decent sized camera, and its weight, it weighs 3.6 pounds. Now I don't know if that's 3.6 pounds or if that's 3 pounds 6 ounces. The information that I could find online didn't specify that, it just said 3.6. And as for the Canon XH-A1, it is 6.4 inches wide by 7.4 inches tall by 13.8 inches long. So this camera is a whole inch longer than the Sony FX7 here, but the weight of this guy is 4.5 pounds. Now again, I don't know if that's 4.5 pounds or if that's 4 pounds 5 ounces. Those are pretty much all the comparable specs on it, along with the features of these camcorders. We'll go ahead and get some side-by-side footage along with maybe some not side-by-side footage to compare the two. We'll see how they compare with audio and video quality. Okay, so here is the audio test, indoor audio test for the Sony FX7. Now you can obviously tell it's probably going to be a little echoey. My little studio or office, if you want to call it. It's a very small room. It's probably like 10 foot by maybe 8 foot. Very, very small, and it's going to be very echoey in here. That's why I usually use my little lavalier mic. Yeah, this is what the audio sounds like on the Sony FX7. Okay, and you're now hearing the audio on the Canon XH-A1 on the indoor test. It's going to be very echoey because I'm in a very small room. Let me know what camera you think has the best onboard mic. It might sound very similar. This is the indoor audio test for the Canon XH-A1 FX7. Both of these cameras are on auto lock mode, just to give them the, I guess, most fair advantage. So there's no manual settings or anything, just letting the cameras do what they're supposed to do in auto mode. All the clips in this will be in auto lock mode. This is the outdoor audio test for the Canon XH-A1. There's no wind out here, so you're not going to get any wind noise in the mic right now, but you might be able to hear some birds and stuff like that, but my voice will probably sound a lot better out here than it does inside. So yeah, this is the outdoor audio test for the Canon XH-A1, and both of these cameras have the Step 2 ND filter on. And this is the audio test for the Sony FX7, the outdoor audio test. Again, there's no wind going on out here, so you're not going to get any wind noise in the microphone. You might hear some birds and stuff like that, but yeah, let me know what camera you think has the better audio indoor and outdoor. And this camera has a Step 2 ND filter on as well. Okay, so I'm testing out the widescreen capability for these two camcorders. I have them both right next to each other, pretty much at the exact same height. And from just looking at the two screens, it looks like the Canon XH-A1 does have a wider angle on the wide angle capability. I think that's a win for that. These two cameras are about 6 to 7 feet away from me right now, so definitely a great thing for the Canon XH-A1. It has a much wider angle when it's zoomed all the way out than the Sony FX7. So in this test, I test how close you can be with the camera and still be able to zoom in and get a clear image. So the camera itself was about 2 inches from this flower. You can zoom in about 3/4 of the way before it starts losing focus. So I would say at about 12 to 15 times zoom, you start losing focus on it. So you can get pretty close and still get good macro shots. I didn't clarify last time, but the last clip was with the Canon XH-A1, and we're now recording with the Sony FX7. And we're about 2 inches away from the flower in this clip as well. So let's go ahead and zoom in and see if it keeps focus. So I would say that this one loses focus much later than the Canon XH-A1 does. I'm almost all the way zoomed in here. So I would say about maybe a 17 to 18 times zoom before you start losing focus on it. So that's really, really good. You have a really great macro focus with the Sony FX7, and I think it still has a lot of good detail here. Again, they're both about 2 inches away from this here flower. And this is a moving stabilization test with both cameras, and just to note, the Canon XH-A1, I was using an old tape, so the footage might be a little glitchy looking. So now that we've gone over everything, let me know what camera you would rather have. Would you rather have the Sony FX7 or would you rather have the Canon XH-A1? Now just a note, these cameras, they're not very reliable camcorders. So if you do get a used one, just make sure it's in working condition, or if you know how to fix them, you can probably get a cheaper one and fix it yourself. The Sony FX7 and the Canon XH-A1, they both have tape deck issues, so they have issues things on the inside breaking or whatever reason that they have to have issues reading tapes. They'll both throw a code. The Sony ones will usually give you a specific code. Canon ones will just tell you to eject the tape. So you don't really get a code to kind of Google and figure out what that code is. I do have the Canon XH-A1 for sale on my eBay store. If you are looking for one of those, you can definitely pick this one up. I'll leave a link in the description. It'll come with the whole camera, it'll come with a battery and a charger. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure you like it. And if you like the content, make sure you subscribe, because we talk about old school retro camcorders almost on a weekly basis. And on that note, we'll see you in the next video. Have a good one.